The highway was almost empty that night. In northern Alberta, winter had already swallowed the land. Snow covered the shoulders of Highway 63 like a thick white blanket, and the wind dragged frozen powder across the asphalt in thin ghostly lines. The road stretched endlessly between dark forests and silent oil fields. At that hour, only truckers and the occasional late travelers still moved through it. Around midnight, a red Kenworth truck slowed near a flickering roadside sign. Cross Family Meats. Fresh cuts, local beef. The neon tube buzzed weakly against the cold. Inside the truck, Daniel Rourke rubbed his eyes. He had been driving for 9 hours straight from Fort McMurray, hauling drilling equipment south. His shoulders ached and his stomach felt hollow. He glanced at the small wooden building beside the sign. A butcher shop. Out here, places like that were rare. Most roadside stops were gas stations or diners. A butcher shop meant hot food, maybe fresh jerky. Daniel pulled the truck into the gravel lot. The tires crunched loudly on frozen stones as he parked under a dim yellow lamp. The shop looked older than the sign suggested. Wooden siding, a narrow porch, frost crawling along the windows. But the lights were on. And inside, someone was moving. Daniel stepped down from the cab, his boots hitting the frozen ground with a dull thud. The cold cut through his jacket instantly. He pulled his collar up and walked to the door. A small bell rang when he pushed it open. Warm air wrapped around him immediately, carrying the heavy smell of smoked meat and spices. Behind the counter stood a woman. She looked to be in her mid-30s. Dark hair tied back neatly. A white butcher's apron hung over a flannel shirt. Her sleeves were rolled just enough to show strong forearms dusted lightly with flour and salt. She smiled. "Evening," she said calmly. "Long drive?" Daniel nodded, stomping snow from his boots. "Yeah. Thought this place was closed." "Not yet," she replied. "Truckers keep odd hours." Her voice was steady and warm, the kind that made people relax without realizing it. Daniel stepped closer to the glass display. Rows of steaks rested neatly on trays. Thick cuts of meat, deep red with clean white fat. Sausages hung from hooks behind the counter, slowly smoking in a metal chamber near the back wall. "Smells amazing," Daniel said. The woman nodded slightly. "Everything's fresh." He pointed to a thick steak. "That one." She opened the display case and lifted the cut with practiced hands. The knife she used to trim the edge moved quickly and precisely, like she had been doing it for decades. "You from around here?" Daniel asked. The woman wrapped the meat in brown butcher paper. "Not originally." "Where from?" "Montana." Daniel laughed softly. "Figures. Canadians are usually nicer." The woman smiled again, though something in her eyes didn't quite change. "That's what people say." She handed him the wrapped steak. He placed a few bills on the counter. As she reached for the money, Daniel noticed something strange behind her. A metal door stood slightly open near the back of the shop. Beyond it, he could see part of a stainless steel table. Industrial, like the ones used in slaughterhouses. Above the table hung a row of heavy butcher hooks. Something large rested on the surface under a thick plastic sheet. Daniel frowned slightly. "Busy night?" he joked. The woman followed his glance. For a brief moment, she said nothing. Then she gently pushed the door closed with her foot. "Always something to prepare," she replied. The bell above the door rang again as Daniel stepped outside. The cold returned instantly. He climbed back into his truck, started the engine, and pulled onto the highway, disappearing into the darkness between the trees. Inside the butcher shop, the woman stood still for a moment. Then she turned off the neon sign. The road outside became silent again. She walked slowly toward the back room and pushed the metal door open. The stainless steel table waited under bright white lights. She pulled the plastic sheet away. The shape beneath it was unmistakably human. Marylin Cross reached for her knife. Her movements were calm, precise, almost routine. Outside, the wind carried snow across the empty highway. 7 days later, Daniel Rourke's truck would be found abandoned at a rest stop nearly 60 miles south. The trailer was still attached, the cargo untouched, but Daniel himself had vanished without a trace. Back at the butcher shop on Highway 63, Customers continued to stop for fresh meat. And many of them would later say the same thing. They had never tasted steak that good before. Long before anyone on Highway 63 knew her name, Marylin Cross had already learned how to cut through bone. She was born in 1964 in a small ranching town outside Billings, Montana. The kind of place where winter winds rattled the windows all night and the smell of livestock never really left the air. Her father worked as a slaughterhouse mechanic, fixing conveyor belts and hydraulic saws in the local meat processing plant. When Marylin was 13, he began taking her there on weekends. Most kids would have refused. Not Marylin. The slaughterhouse was loud, metallic, and always warm, even in winter. Chains rattled above the concrete floors, and the air carried the thick smell of iron and disinfectant. Workers moved quickly along the processing line, each person responsible for a single step. Cut, trim, separate. Efficiency mattered more than anything. Marylin watched everything. Her father first showed her the knives. How they were sharpened, how they were held, and how small mistakes could ruin an entire cut of meat. Every piece has a line, he told her once, guiding her hand along a side of beef. You just need to know where to follow it. She learned quickly. By 16, she could separate muscle from bone faster than some of the full-time workers. But what people remembered most about her wasn't skill. It was how calm she remained, even on the kill floor. Most new workers struggled the first time they saw an animal being stunned and bled. Some looked away. Others grew sick. Marylin simply watched. Quiet. Focused. The plant manager once joked to her father that she had the nerves of a surgeon. Her father laughed. Marylin didn't. Years later, in 1996, Marylin left Montana. No one in Billings knew exactly why. Some said she wanted to start her own business. Others thought she simply wanted a quieter place to live. By then she had worked several years in small butcher shops, learning every part of the trade. She knew suppliers. She knew equipment. And she knew that remote highways were the best places to open a meat shop. People on the road didn't ask many questions. Northern Alberta turned out to be perfect. Oil fields were expanding around Fort McMurray. Workers traveled constantly between towns and job sites. Truckers drove long stretches of highway without seeing more than a gas station. And along one lonely section of Highway 63, Marylin found what she was looking for. The building had once been a family grocery store decades earlier. By the time she bought it, the roof sagged slightly and the parking lot was nothing more than packed gravel. But the structure was solid. And the back room had enough space for a full cutting table and freezer units. Within 3 months, the place had a new sign. Cross Family Meats. The word family was intentional. People trusted family businesses. The locals noticed her quickly. At first, some were suspicious of the quiet American woman who worked alone behind the counter. But Marylin knew how to win them over. Her prices were fair. Her cuts were clean. And her smoked sausage became popular with truckers almost immediately. She never talked much about herself. If customers asked where she learned to butcher so well, she would simply say, "Back home." Within a year, the shop had become a familiar stop along the highway. Truckers pulled in for jerky. Oil workers grabbed steaks after long shifts. Hunters occasionally brought deer for processing. No one thought it strange that Marylin often worked late into the night. After all, meat had to be prepared. Freezers had to be stocked. And truckers kept strange hours. But there was something else Marylin studied carefully. People. She noticed the difference between locals and travelers. Locals chatted, asked about the weather, complained about work. Travelers were different. They were alone. They rarely stayed long. And most importantly, no one in town knew them. Marylin kept mental notes. License plates. Voices. The way some people carried themselves when they walked into the shop. Some customers were cautious. Others trusted her immediately. Those were the ones she paid attention to. Because every now and then, someone would arrive who had no one waiting for them nearby. Someone who could disappear quietly into the long northern winter. For nearly 2 years after opening the shop, nothing unusual happened. The freezer stayed full. The business grew slowly. And the woman from Montana remained just another quiet shop owner along Highway 63. Until the night a stranded tourist knocked on her door. That night would change everything. Because Marylin Cross had spent years learning how to cut meat. She had never used those skills on a human body before. But when the moment finally came, she would discover something unsettling. The difference wasn't nearly as big as most people imagined. The first time it happened, it wasn't planned. At least, that's what Marylin Cross would later tell investigators. It was late October of 1999. Winter had already begun creeping across northern Alberta, coating the forests with frost and turning the long stretches of Highway 63 into narrow corridors of gray ice and drifting snow. Business had been slow that evening. Marylin was cleaning the counter when she noticed headlights slowing outside the shop. The vehicle rolled into the gravel lot unevenly, its engine coughing before finally shutting off. A small sedan. Not local. She watched through the window as a man stepped out, pulling his jacket tighter against the wind. He looked to be in his early 30s, maybe younger. Thin. Tired. He hesitated before entering. The bell above the door rang softly. "Sorry," he said quickly, brushing snow from his shoulders. "I saw the lights. My car's having trouble." Marylin set the rag down calmly. "You're not the first person tonight," she replied. The man gave a nervous laugh. "Engine started making a noise about 20 miles back. Thought I could make it to the next town." "You probably can't," Marylin said. She wasn't being rude. Just honest. He glanced around the shop. The smell of smoked meat filled the warm room. Behind the counter, the display case was already mostly empty. Only a few cuts remained under the glass. "You got a phone?" he asked. Marylin nodded toward the wall. A small landline hung beside the doorway. He walked over and dialed slowly, pressing the receiver tight to his ear while staring through the window at his car. After a moment he sighed. "No signal," he muttered. "Storm's coming," Marylin said. "Lines get unreliable." The man rubbed his face with both hands. "My name's Eric, by the way." "Marylin. Nice place you've got here." "Thank you." He stepped back toward the counter. "Listen, you wouldn't happen to know if there's a motel nearby?" Marylin shook her head. "Closest one is 40 miles south." Eric looked back toward the door again. The wind outside had grown louder. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Marylin said something simple. "You can stay here tonight." He blinked in surprise. "Seriously?" "I've got a spare room in the back. Truckers use it sometimes when the weather gets bad." Relief washed across his face instantly. "Thank you," he said. "I'll be gone first thing in the morning." Marylin nodded once. "No problem." An hour later, the shop was closed. The neon sign outside buzzed faintly before going dark. In the back room, Eric sat at a small wooden table eating a hot plate of stew Marylin had prepared. "You didn't have to do this," he said between bites. "Traveling alone gets harder in winter." He nodded. "I'm driving to Edmonton. New job. Oil work. Construction." Marylin listened quietly while washing a knife at the sink. Eric kept talking. About the job. About the long drive from British Columbia. About how excited he was to start over somewhere new. People often talked when they felt safe. Eventually his voice slowed. The food and warmth had made him drowsy. "You mind if I turn in?" he asked. "Room's down the hall," Marylin said. He thanked her again before disappearing into the small guest room. The door closed. Silence filled the building. Marylin stood motionless at the sink for a long moment. Water dripped from the blade she was holding. Her eyes slowly moved toward the hallway. She could hear him moving around inside the room. A suitcase zipper. Footsteps. Then the creak of a bed. After several minutes, the sounds stopped. Marylin dried the knife carefully. Then she walked to the hallway. The door to the guest room was not locked. She pushed it open slowly. Eric lay asleep under a thick blanket, breathing heavily. His jacket hung on the back of a chair. His wallet rested on the small nightstand beside the bed. Marylin stepped inside. Her movements were quiet, precise. The knife in her hand never shook. Years later, detectives would say the entire thing probably lasted less than 30 seconds. There were no neighbors close enough to hear anything. Outside, The wind howled through the dark forest along the highway. Inside the butcher shop, Marylin Cross stood over the bed in complete silence. When it was over, she didn't panic. She didn't rush. Instead, she simply looked down at the still figure for a long time. Her expression remained calm, almost thoughtful. Then her eyes drifted toward the metal door leading to the preparation room, the same room where she had processed thousands of pounds of beef over the years. For the first time in her life, she asked herself a question. What exactly was the difference? Within the hour, the stainless steel table was clean and brightly lit. And Marylin Cross began working the way she always had. Carefully, methodically, following the lines she had learned to see since childhood. By sunrise, Eric's broken car still sat in the frozen gravel outside the shop. But Eric himself had already disappeared. And inside the freezer, new packages of meat rested beside the ordinary cuts. Wrapped neatly in brown paper. Labeled in Marylin's careful handwriting. The shop would reopen at 8 in the morning. Customers would arrive soon. And Marylin Cross had just discovered a secret that would change the rest of her life. The first few days after Eric vanished were strangely quiet. Marylin Cross expected something: panic, regret, fear. Something that would tell her she had crossed a line that could never be undone. But nothing came. The butcher shop opened the next morning just like always. Snow covered the gravel lot outside. The neon sign flickered to life above the door. Inside, the smell of smoked meat slowly filled the warm air. Marylin stood behind the counter in her white apron, sharpening a knife the way she did every morning. A local mechanic named Glenn walked in around 9. "Morning, Marylin," he said, stomping snow from his boots. "Morning." He glanced into the display case. "Got anything good today?" Marylin reached inside and lifted a thick red steak from one of the trays. "Fresh cuts." Glenn smiled. "You always say that." He paid in cash, took the wrapped package, and left without another question. Marylin watched the door close behind him. Her eyes moved slowly back to the display case. Inside were several cuts she had prepared the night before, mixed carefully among ordinary beef. The difference was invisible, even to someone who worked with meat every day. For almost a week, she waited. Every time a police cruiser passed along the highway, Marylin glanced toward the window. Every time a stranger entered the shop, she wondered if they were asking questions about a missing man. But the days passed normally. Truckers stopped for jerky. Oil workers bought steaks. Hunters dropped off deer for processing. No one asked about Eric. His car, abandoned in the gravel lot, had eventually been towed away by a highway patrol truck. According to the brief conversation Marylin overheard between the tow driver and a local officer, the vehicle would likely be reported missing later. But that was all. No search teams. No questions. Nothing. The realization came slowly. Eric had been traveling alone. No one nearby knew him. And somewhere far away, someone might eventually notice he never arrived in Edmonton, but by then the trail would be cold. Marylin understood something important that week. Highways swallowed people. Winter deepened as November approached. Snowstorms rolled across northern Alberta in thick waves, forcing drivers to slow and sometimes stop entirely. Those nights were the busiest for Marylin's shop. Travelers hated driving through storms. Many preferred to wait them out somewhere warm. One evening near the end of the month, a large pickup truck pulled into the lot just before closing. The driver stepped inside, brushing snow from his shoulders. He looked strong and heavily built, with oil-stained work clothes and a beard dusted with ice. "Place still open?" he asked. "Just barely," Marylin replied. He chuckled. "Good enough." The man introduced himself as Caleb Turner, a temporary worker from one of the drilling sites north of Fort McMurray. "Been on shift 16 hours, he said, stretching his arms. "All I want is something real to eat." Marylin served him a hot sandwich and coffee at the small table in the back room. Caleb talked constantly while he ate. About the drilling site. About the brutal hours. About the money he hoped to save before heading home to Saskatchewan. Marylin listened politely. She noticed something familiar about him. He carried no luggage. No co-workers had come with him. And when he mentioned the drilling site, he added something that caught her attention. I'm only here 2 more days, he said between bites. Then I'm gone. 2 days. That meant no one would be looking for him immediately. The same quiet calculation formed in Marylin's mind again. Not panic. Not hesitation. Just evaluation. Like examining a cut of meat before deciding where to place the knife. Outside, the storm grew stronger. Wind rattled the shop windows. Snow buried the highway in drifting white. Caleb finished his sandwich and leaned back in his chair. Mind if I sit a while? He asked. Road's a mess out there. Marylin poured him another cup of coffee. Take your time. She watched him drink. Watched his heavy eyelids begin to droop from exhaustion. Watched his shoulders relax as the warmth of the shop wrapped around him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Marylin stood and quietly locked the front door. The bolt slid into place with a soft metallic click. Caleb didn't even look up. Outside, Highway 63 disappeared beneath another wave of falling snow. And inside the small butcher shop, Marylin Cross began repeating the same careful routine she had discovered only weeks earlier. This time, however, there was no hesitation. No uncertainty. Only practice. By morning, the storm had passed. A plowed truck cleared the highway shortly after sunrise. Travel resumed normally. And in the display case at Cross Family Meats, several new cuts of meat had been added. Customers would later say that winter had been the best season the shop ever had. The steaks were always fresh. The supply never seemed to run out. And Marylin Cross always worked late into the night, preparing more. By the winter of 2000, Cross Family Meats had become a familiar stop for drivers traveling along Highway 63. Truckers talked about it on their radios. Good jerky. Cheap steaks. American Lady runs it. For people driving the long, lonely road between Fort McMurray and the smaller towns to the south, the butcher shop was a welcome sight in the middle of endless forest and frozen fields. Marylin Cross understood that reputation mattered. She kept the shop clean. She greeted every customer with the same calm smile. And she never rushed anyone who wanted to sit at the small table in the back room and warm up for a while. But behind the friendly routine, something else had begun to grow. Experience. Marylin no longer acted on impulse. After Caleb Turner, she had become careful, methodical in ways even she had not expected. She watched people closely before making decisions. Some customers were locals. They talked too much, asked too many questions, or mentioned family members waiting for them nearby. Those people were never considered. Others passed through quickly. Travelers. Workers. Hitchhikers. People moving along the highway without roots in the area. Those were the ones Marylin studied. By February, another opportunity appeared. He arrived late one evening, just before closing. A young man with a backpack and a thin winter jacket stepped through the door, shivering from the cold. The bell rang above him. Marylin looked up from the counter. Evening, she said. The man rubbed his hands together. You guys still open? Until 9. He nodded gratefully and walked toward the display case. I'm looking for something cheap, he said. Been hitchhiking most of the day. Marylin noticed the details immediately. No car. No luggage except the backpack. His accent suggested he wasn't from Alberta. Where you headed? She asked. South, he said. Eventually Vancouver. He introduced himself as Ryan Walker, 24 years old. He had left a construction job in Fort McMurray after an argument with his supervisor and decided to head west. Figure I'll find something better out there, he said. Marylin wrapped a small portion of smoked sausage and handed it to him. On the house. Ryan looked surprised. Seriously? You look like you could use it. He thanked her and sat at the back table to eat. Outside, the sky had already turned dark. Snow fell lightly across the highway, illuminated by the shop's porch light. Ryan finished the food quickly. Best thing I've eaten in days, he said. Marylin watched him wipe his hands on a napkin. Storm's coming again tonight, she said quietly. Ryan glanced toward the window. You think? Temperature's dropping fast. He hesitated. Any place nearby I could crash? Marylin had heard the same question before. The same hopeful tone. She nodded toward the hallway behind the shop. Small guest room in the back. Ryan smiled. You're saving my life tonight. Marylin didn't answer. 2 weeks later, another traveler disappeared. This time it was a truck driver named Mark Delaney. Unlike Ryan, Mark had been a regular on the highway. Other drivers knew him well enough to notice when he stopped answering radio calls. His truck was discovered parked at a rest area nearly 50 miles south. The engine was cold, the cargo untouched, and Mark Delaney was gone. At first, the disappearances didn't seem connected. Northern highways were dangerous places. People got lost. Cars broke down in remote areas. Sometimes travelers simply changed plans without telling anyone. But by early spring, something about the pattern began to bother the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. 4 people had vanished along Highway 63 in less than a year. Killed. Ryan. The missing persons reports came from different provinces, different backgrounds, different jobs. But they all shared one detail. Their last known locations were somewhere along the same lonely stretch of road. For weeks, the reports sat quietly in regional files. Then one officer noticed something unusual: the distance between the disappearances. Each person had last been seen within roughly 20 miles of the same roadside business. A small butcher shop. One afternoon in April, a black RCMP cruiser rolled slowly along the gravel lot outside Cross Family Meats. Inside, Marylin was arranging fresh cuts in the display case. She noticed the vehicle immediately, but she didn't react. The door opened. A tall officer stepped inside, removing his gloves. The bell rang softly above the entrance. "Afternoon," he said. Marylin looked up and smiled politely. "Can I help you?" The officer glanced around the shop. His name was Sergeant Daniel Hargreaves, and he had been reviewing the Highway 63 disappearance reports for the past week. "This place get a lot of travelers?" he asked casually. Marylin wiped her hands on a cloth. "Most of my customers are drivers." He nodded slowly. Then he asked a question that would later appear in the official case file. "You remember anyone named Mark Delaney?" For the first time in months, Marylin Cross felt something she had not experienced since the night of her first kill. Not fear, but awareness. Because the police had finally arrived. And the road that had hidden her secrets for so long was beginning to lead them closer. By the spring of 2000, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police had begun piecing together the strange pattern of disappearances along Highway 63. It started with a casual observation: for missing persons in less than a year, all last seen within a 20-mile stretch of road in northern Alberta. Each case had initially seemed isolated, dismissed as the normal risk of remote travel. But now, detectives realized the coincidences were too precise to ignore. Sergeant Daniel Hargreaves, assigned to the Northern Patrol Division, became the unofficial lead investigator. A veteran of the RCMP for over 15 years, he had seen his share of accidents, missing persons, and highway tragedies. But something about this string of disappearances unsettled him. He drove the length of the highway repeatedly, stopping at rest areas, diners, and small motels, asking questions and quietly observing. Most locals shrugged. Northern Alberta was a place of tough, independent people. Strangers came and went without notice. But Hargreaves kept noticing one name popping up in conversations: a small roadside butcher shop, run by a woman from Montana. The shop's owner, Marylin Cross, was widely regarded as polite and professional. Truckers praised the freshness of her meat, oil field workers liked her smoked sausage, and locals appreciated her modest prices. Yet, Hargreaves sensed something was off. The pattern was too precise, and the shop's location, isolated, easily accessible to stranded travelers, fit every known last sighting. Hargreaves began discreetly documenting the shop. Surveillance at first was simple: daytime observation of customers, noting vehicles and license plates. He asked fellow officers to keep track of any trucks or travelers stopping late at night. Marylin Cross seemed aware but never overtly suspicious. Her routine was consistent: shop opens in the morning, displays cleaned and restocked, occasional guest stays in the back room. Nothing out of place, yet Hargreaves decided to approach the disappearances systematically. He compiled a timeline. Eric Rourke, Last seen October 1999, small red sedan, traveling north to Edmonton. Caleb Turner, November 1999, temporary oil field worker, arrived in pickup truck during snowstorm. Ryan Walker, February 2000, lone hitchhiker, thin backpack, headed west. Mark Delaney, March 2000, veteran trucker, vehicle abandoned at rest stop 50 miles south. All four had one unifying detail: last known location within proximity of Cross family meets. Hargreaves requested vehicle registration records for trucks and sedans reported near the shop. He reviewed missing person reports from neighboring provinces. Each discovery tightened the circle of suspicion. Forensics would not yet have much to examine. No bodies, no obvious crime scene. But the RCMP could monitor behavioral patterns, witness statements, and logistics. Hargreaves also began interviewing frequent customers: truckers, hunters, oil workers. They described the shop's owner as polite, efficient, and pleasant, but Hargreaves was trained to notice micro-expressions, pauses, and inconsistencies in speech. A single question about missing travelers often prompted slight hesitation or a shift in eye contact. Nothing concrete yet, but enough to merit further attention. Winter and early spring were harsh in northern Alberta. Nights remained long, temperatures often dipping below -30 degrees Celsius. The isolation worked in Marylin's favor. A stranded traveler could disappear without immediate notice. Roads were icy, forests dense, and the town population sparse. For a calculated predator, the environment was ideal. Meanwhile, Marylin continued her routines undisturbed. She sharpened knives, smoked sausages, and meticulously labeled the cuts in the display case. She noticed the occasional RCMP car along the highway, but she never acted nervously. That calmness, Hargreaves later noted, was both unnerving and typical of certain high-functioning criminals. By mid-spring, the investigation expanded. Surveillance cameras at nearby gas stations and rest stops were checked. Officer logs cross-referenced vehicle sightings. Any anomalies were flagged: unknown plates, unusual stops, or travelers who seemed to vanish without explanation. It was during this stage that Hargreaves got his first real break. A trucker remembered seeing Marylin's pickup parked outside late at night, even when the shop was closed. He recalled the truck sitting unnaturally long in the gravel lot, engine off, lights dim. It was nothing that would raise immediate alarm to the average passerby, but Hargreaves' instincts screamed otherwise. The investigation was now in motion. Patterns were emerging. Timing, location, vehicle records, and witness statements began to form a chain pointing to a single location: the small butcher shop. The next logical step would be to watch the shop more closely. Night shifts, guest room usage, deliveries. Every detail mattered. And Marylin Cross, calm and composed behind her counter, remained blissfully unaware of how close the RCMP was to noticing her meticulous routines. Because in her mind, every movement was calculated, every cut precise, every visitor a temporary factor in her growing business. Yet now, under the relentless scrutiny of the RCMP, that carefully constructed order was beginning to unravel. By early summer of 2000, the RCMP had begun more active surveillance on Cross family meets. Sergeant Daniel Hargreaves and his team set up observation points along the highway, often stationed in unmarked vehicles hidden among the trees and snow-mottled brush. They needed to watch without being noticed. The shop itself sat on a small rise, giving a clear line of sight from the gravel lot to the front porch and windows. It was perfect for a predator like Marylin Cross, but now it would also become perfect for the investigators. The first few nights, the shop seemed normal. Marylin arrived at the usual hour, unlocking the front door with precision, sweeping the floor, and placing fresh cuts of meat in the display case. Truckers stopped briefly, picked up prepackaged sausages or steaks, paid in cash, and moved on. No unusual behavior, at least on the surface. But Hargreaves noticed small details that didn't align with ordinary operations. Late-night trips to the back room with large covered trays. Extended periods when the guest room light flickered on and off without any visitors being seen. Deliveries of meat in the dead of night that seemed to come from nowhere. No trucks, no registered suppliers. Each of these was minor on its own. Together, they painted a picture. On one particularly cold night, a team of 2 officers parked along the edge of the forest observed a lone vehicle pull up. A man stepped out, looking exhausted. He was dressed in a construction vest and carried a duffel bag. Marylin greeted him warmly, offering coffee and a hot meal. The officers noted how casually she interacted, her tone friendly, almost motherly. Yet Hargreaves, watching through binoculars, felt the same unease he had when he first arrived. There was something unnatural in her calm demeanor. After 15 minutes, the man was led through the back hallway. The officers couldn't see beyond the slightly ajar metal door at the end of the corridor, but the way he disappeared from view was enough to trigger further scrutiny. Hargreaves made a note: backroom activity unusual, subject enters alone. Investigate guest room and freezer usage. Over the next weeks, officers began tracking every vehicle. License plates were photographed and cross-referenced with missing person reports. They noted unusual patterns. Cars and trucks would stop late at night, never seen again for days, and yet the shop continued regular business in the daytime. Marylin's routine was flawless. She cleaned knives after each use, sanitized surfaces, and never left traces outside the obvious. Every movement was deliberate. Even when she sensed someone watching from afar, she adjusted minimally, just enough to avoid suspicion. One night, Hargreaves' team observed something different. A delivery van parked quietly behind the shop. The back door opened. Several large boxes were moved inside, covered immediately with sheets. No receipts, no registered delivery. When Marylin exited a few minutes later, her apron was spotless. Not a drop of blood, not a smudge, nothing out of the ordinary. "That's not normal," muttered Constable Reed, an officer with 10 years in Northern Patrol. Hargreaves nodded. "Exactly. That's what predators look like. Small, careful actions to hide large truths." Marylin herself was unaware of how close they were. She maintained her daily facade flawlessly: polite greetings, clean displays, helpful advice about cuts of meat. She even smiled at the occasional officer driving by during the day, offering a quick nod. Yet at night, her world remained tightly controlled. Every step in the shop, every movement to the freezer or back room, was rehearsed in her mind. Every visitor had been assessed for risk. She had learned from experience. Attention to detail prevented mistakes. But now, the eyes of the RCMP were on her, documenting every irregularity. The officers began taking photos through the windows. They mapped the internal layout from sight lines outside. Every package, every table, every door leading to the back room and guest quarters was noted. By the end of June, Hargreaves felt confident enough to request a warrant. The next step would be an actual search. For Marylin Cross, the shop had been her kingdom, her laboratory, and her sanctuary. But it was about to become a crime scene under the scrutiny of the law. And for the first time, the woman from Montana, calm, precise, and confident, faced the undeniable reality that someone was watching. Someone who would not leave until the truth was uncovered. It was early July when the RCMP finally secured a warrant. Sergeant Daniel Hargreaves had presented months of careful surveillance, witness statements, and license plate logs. While there was no concrete physical evidence yet, the patterns were undeniable: missing travelers, unexplained overnight stays, and suspicious late-night activity at Cross family meets. The judge had signed the search warrant with a terse signature, unaware of the horrors that awaited inside the little butcher shop. Hargreaves and a team of 6 officers arrived just before dawn. The morning air was crisp, and the remnants of the night's frost glittered along the gravel lot. They parked discreetly behind the small forested rise and approached the shop in silence, their breath visible in the cold air. Marylin Cross arrived minutes later, as if on cue. She opened the shop and began her usual morning routine: sweeping, adjusting display trays, arranging fresh cuts. She wore her flannel shirt and white apron, the same calm expression as always. Hargreaves nodded to his team. No one moved toward the door yet. They watched her for a few minutes, noting her habitual checking of the freezer doors, her wiping of knives, and the meticulous arrangement of labels on the packaged meat. Every motion precise, deliberate. Finally, Hargreaves stepped forward. "Marylin Cross, he called, his voice firm but professional. She turned, expression unchanged. Yes. We have a warrant to search your premises. Marylyn's hands folded in front of her apron. Of course. Please, come in. Her voice was calm, polite, almost welcoming. The search began in the front shop. Officers inspected freezers, display cases, and storage racks. Everything seemed normal, sheets of neatly wrapped meat, sausages hanging from hooks, labels in perfect handwriting. But Hargreaves was trained to notice details. There were irregularities. Some labels were newer than others. Cuts of meat did not match what she had advertised. Some seemed unusually thick, marbled, and dark. The real breakthrough came when officers moved to the back room. There, hidden behind the usual butcher tables and industrial equipment, they discovered a metal door, slightly ajar. Behind it were stainless steel tables, saws, and a large freezer unit. Hargreaves signaled the team to proceed with caution. Inside the freezer, they found packages wrapped meticulously in brown butcher paper. The labels indicated cuts and dates. But as forensic officers began examining them, the horrifying truth became undeniable. The DNA swabs taken from the surfaces matched missing person reports, human remains. Officers recoiled at the smell, a mixture of cold and lingering smoke from the small smoking chamber nearby. In addition to the freezer, they found several partial skeletons, carefully separated and labeled. Clothing items from known missing persons. Dental prosthetics and fragments of personal items, including wallets and watches. A set of knives and saws with traces of human tissue. Every piece was catalogued meticulously. Even with protective gear, the scene was shocking. Marylin stood silently, hands folded, expression still calm. Hargreaves observed her for a long moment, studying her reaction. She betrayed no fear, no panic. Just the same controlled demeanor that had concealed months of careful killings. When questioned, she said nothing beyond polite acknowledgments. Outside, the officers coordinated with forensic teams and anthropologists flown in from Edmonton. They began identifying victims, matching clothing, and confirming DNA profiles. Over the next week, every missing person along the section of Highway 63 from Eric Rourke to Mark Delaney was accounted for. The discovery shocked not just the RCMP but the local communities. Truckers who had spoken fondly of Cross family meats were horrified to learn the truth. Oil workers, hunters, and locals alike struggled to reconcile the friendly, polite woman they had seen with the horrors uncovered behind the walls of her shop. For Hargreaves, the scene confirmed everything he had suspected months ago. The pattern was now undeniable. Marylin Cross was a serial killer, a predator who had exploited isolation, weather, and human trust to commit crimes over months, possibly years. She was immediately taken into custody, handcuffed, and transported to the RCMP detachment in Fort McMurray. The interview room was stark, fluorescent lit, and cold. For the first time, Marylyn's calm was challenged. Yet even then she answered questions with precise, measured words. No emotional outbursts. No panic. Just a controlled, almost clinical demeanor. For the RCMP, the case had moved from theory to certainty. Every disappearance, every unreported missing traveler, had now found its source. Marylin Cross would not leave the station voluntarily. She had been caught, and all the evidence, from skeletons to personal effects, was now indisputable. The investigation had reached its climax. But for Marylin, it was only the beginning of a chain of legal consequences that would take her far from the quiet highway where she had built her deadly enterprise. The courtroom in Fort McMurray was small, almost intimate, but the tension inside it was immense. For the first time, the name Marylin Cross echoed beyond the walls of her little butcher shop. Locals, truckers, and journalists filled the benches. Everyone had heard whispers of the gruesome discoveries along Highway 63, but seeing her in person, calm, composed, and wearing the standard beige prison uniform, was something else entirely. Sergeant Daniel Hargreaves sat in the back, his notebook filled with months of observations, witness statements, and surveillance logs. For him, this trial was the culmination of almost a year's work: the investigation, the stakeouts, the meticulous gathering of evidence that had led to Marylin's arrest. The prosecution began with a detailed recounting of the disappearances. Eric Rourke, last seen October 1999. Caleb Turner, November 1999. Ryan Walker, February 2000. Mark Delaney, March 2000. Forensic specialists took the stand first. One by one, anthropologists and DNA analysts explained how human remains had been identified in Marylin's freezer. Fragments of bone, teeth, and clothing items matched the missing persons. Each identification was cross-referenced with police reports, eyewitness testimony, and, in some cases, dental records. The courtroom was silent as Dr. Helena Price, a forensic anthropologist from Edmonton, described the state of the remains. These victims were disarticulated post-mortem and carefully packaged. The cuts show precision consistent with someone trained in butchery, she said, pointing to photographs of the stainless steel tables, knives, and hooks recovered from the back room of Cross family meats. Marylin listened quietly. Her face betrayed nothing. Hargreaves noted a subtle, almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw, but otherwise she remained composed. Next, the prosecution called local truckers and residents. They described the friendly butcher who had sold them steaks and sausages, never suspecting anything sinister behind her polite smile. Witnesses were asked to recount patterns of traffic, unusual overnight stays, and late-night visitors to the shop. Many expressed disbelief that someone they had known for months, or even years, could be capable of such crimes. The defense attempted to undermine the prosecution's timeline, suggesting the disappearances were coincidences unrelated to Marylin. They pointed out that isolation, winter storms, and vehicle malfunctions were common along Highway 63. But the forensic evidence was overwhelming. DNA swabs, teeth, and clothing directly linked Marylin to the victims. During cross-examination, Hargreaves recounted his surveillance. He explained how Marylin had been observed receiving unidentified packages at night, guiding guests into the back room, and displaying consistent, careful concealment of activities that aligned with the disappearances. Finally, the prosecution rested. The courtroom was tense as the jury deliberated. For weeks, they had been presented with photographs, testimony, and meticulously logged data. The evidence pointed clearly to one conclusion: Marylin Cross had intentionally lured, killed, and processed her victims. When the jury returned, the foreperson stood. "We find the defendant guilty on all counts of first-degree murder," they announced. Marylin Cross did not flinch. Her calm demeanor never wavered, even as the courtroom murmured around her. The judge then pronounced the sentence. Given the premeditated nature of these crimes, and the repeated disregard for human life, the court sentences Marylin Cross to 15 years imprisonment in a federal penitentiary. This sentence is to be served in accordance with Canadian law. There was a brief pause, the weight of the sentence settling over everyone. Marylin was led out of the courtroom. Outside, she walked with the same precision she had always exhibited, every step deliberate. Even as the trial concluded, a quiet investigation was already underway by the FBI. Several of the victims, travelers whose disappearance had been attributed to Marylin in Canada, had connections to the United States. Some had crossed state lines before vanishing. Soon, evidence emerged tying Marylin Cross to other disappearances in Montana and neighboring states. She had exploited the long, lonely roads and winter storms along the Canadian-American border in the same way she had with Highway 63. The RCMP cooperated with the FBI. Documents, photographs, and DNA evidence were sent south. American authorities quickly obtained warrants, building a case that would eventually lead to her extradition to the United States. For Marylin, the Canadian sentence was only a temporary containment. Her true reckoning would come in Montana, where the full weight of her crimes would be met with the ultimate punishment. By early 2003, the wheels of international justice had turned. After months of negotiation between the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the FBI, Marylin Cross was formally extradited to Montana. The transport was quiet and heavily secured. Even in handcuffs and under armed guard, she remained composed, her posture precise, her eyes alert. Montana authorities had compiled their case carefully. Several travelers who had vanished years earlier in the U.S. were now linked to Marylin. DNA evidence matched remains recovered from remote areas and property left behind. Clothing, wallets, and personal items, corroborated witness statements and travel logs. The case was airtight. The courtroom in Billings was packed. Media crews from around the state lined the walls, cameras trained on the calm figure of Marylin Cross. Families of victims sat in quiet rows, their expressions a mix of grief and disbelief. For them, seeing her in person, alive, unharmed and calm, was almost unbearable. The prosecution presented the evidence systematically. Forensic analysis of human remains recovered in the U.S., linking them to missing travelers who had passed through Montana. Cross-border travel logs connecting Marylin to multiple locations where victims had disappeared. Photographs and records from Canadian authorities documenting her operations along Highway 63. Witness testimony from locals and truckers who remembered her patterns and peculiar interactions with travelers. The courtroom fell silent as Dr. Helena Price, the forensic anthropologist who had assisted the RCMP, testified via video link. The precision of dismemberment, the consistency in packaging, and the identification of remains leave no doubt. These were deliberate actions performed by someone trained in butchery. All evidence points to Marylin Cross. Marylin Cross sat calmly throughout. Her hands folded in her lap, her eyes meeting the jury's only briefly. There was no denial, no emotional display, only control. During cross-examination, defense attorneys attempted to argue psychological instability, suggesting that Marylin's actions had been a product of trauma and environmental influence. But the prosecution countered with her meticulous planning, the careful concealment of evidence, and the systematic nature of her killings. This was not the act of someone uncontrolled. It was the work of a deliberate, calculating predator. After weeks of testimony, the jury retired to deliberate. Tension in the courthouse was palpable. Families of victims waited anxiously, journalists whispered speculations, and law enforcement officers quietly monitored the proceedings. When the jury returned, the foreperson stood, voice steady. "We find the defendant guilty on all counts of first-degree murder." Marylin's calm remained unbroken. Even as the room filled with murmurs, she listened silently as the judge began the sentencing phase. Given the premeditated nature of the murders, the repeated violation of human life, and the calculated methods employed, this court sentences Marylin Cross to death by firing squad, to be carried out in accordance with Montana state law. Gasps filled the courtroom. Families wept quietly. Marylin Cross, for the first time in her life, remained silent, not moving, not blinking excessively, not showing fear. In the months following the verdict, appeals were filed and denied. The procedural reviews confirmed the validity of the evidence. DNA matches, forensic reports, and cross-border investigative coordination. The courts affirmed the death sentence, scheduling the execution under Montana law. On the morning of her execution, Marylin Cross walked to the chamber with the same deliberate, precise movements that had characterized her life. She did not resist. She did not speak. When the order was given, the firing squad carried out the sentence. The life of the woman who had terrorized northern Alberta and multiple U.S. states ended swiftly, her calm presence replaced by the finality of justice. In the aftermath, investigators reflected on the case as one of the most meticulously concealed serial killings in recent North American history. Marylin Cross had exploited isolation, human trust, and environmental conditions to commit her crimes over years. Her capture required the collaboration of international law enforcement, forensic science, and the unwavering persistence of the RCMP and FBI. Highway 63 returned to its quiet northern rhythm. Truckers continued their routes, oil workers drove past, and locals occasionally recalled the name of the polite American woman who had once run a small roadside butcher shop. But the horror behind her calm, controlled exterior became a stark reminder: even the friendliest face may hide a deadly secret. Justice, finally, had been served.